Hello, my chooms and choombadas, how y'all living? If you looked at my last video on treatments for hair loss, you know that we talked about a possible up-and-coming treatment for androgenic alopecia called SM04554. Now, since this stuff doesn't even have a real name that rolls off the tongue yet, you know that it isn't on the market yet, and indeed, it is still in clinical trials. Like many treatments I have explored in my videos, it does have some theory behind it, as well as some small animal and human studies that suggest it might work. People who create hair loss remedies, though, like to skip the next step and just bring them to the gray market, and then they'll laugh their way to the bank as every desperate hair loss sufferer turns themselves into a human guinea pig. They don't actually bother pursuing the hard work of proving their stuff works using well-designed, randomized, controlled clinical trials. This is true of supposed, quote, natural remedies that are not FDA controlled, things like castor oil or devices that increase blood flow, like the HairGuard Grow Band, but the company making the SM04554 chemical, Samumed, at least is going through the trouble of doing a large clinical trial on over 600 people to validate their drug's safety and efficacy. So more power to them, and let's hope it proves not only to be helpful in treating androgenic alopecia, but starts a trend in people using higher evidence-based standards before putting their treatment on the market. Now, it's not that we don't already have good treatments on the market for androgenic alopecia. We do have finasteride, minoxidil, and these two treatments have been validated time and time again in large clinical trials, and they have proven to be safe and effective in the majority of people who take them, and that is why they are FDA approved. But that doesn't mean it wouldn't be helpful to find other treatments that could be used as adjunctive therapy with finasteride and minoxidil, or could possibly even be used to substitute in the rare case where there are side effects that don't go away with continued use and which can't be tolerated. There is always room for new and better drugs for any medical problem, so hence why we took a look at SM04554. But another reason we looked at this drug was because of its supposed novel mechanism by which it works. It is a stimulator of what is called the WNT or Wnt pathway, and by all means, in case you haven't seen it yet, take a look at the video which I made on it, and I'll go ahead and link that below. But the too long didn't read version is that the Wnt pathway stimulates stem cells in the scalp to become hair follicle cells. So this pathway is important for hair growth, but we already know that androgenic alopecia is due to the worthless trash hormone DHT, which is created by the enzyme 5A reductase, which ruins the alpha Chad hormone testosterone by turning it into the beta bitch hormone DHT, dihydrotestosterone. One of the reasons why I like these upcoming treatments is that they're not trying to fearmonger about finasteride the way you see with charlatans like HairGuard or Atigen, the way they always say that you got to use their products because finasteride is so evil and it's going to ruin your life. Rather, what these companies promoting these products do is that they promote their treatments as addressing hair loss through a different pathway. So it gives us an additional weapon that we can use in the fight against hair loss potentially by itself, but definitely at least in conjunction with existing treatments. So what I mean by that is that these newer treatments are not just inhibitors of the 5AR enzyme like finasteride, and they're also not direct anti-androgens like you see with something like Breezula or Floridol. These newer treatments are addressing a lesser known and lesser research mechanism behind hair loss, which doesn't ignore the underlying cause of hair loss, but rather addresses it in a different way. So we're not seeing anything that we know is bullshit, since it isn't claiming hair loss is caused by some nonsense like poor circulation or lack of blood flow. So to further extrapolate on that, let's review what I said in my SM04554 video. I said based on the research that too much DHT in the hair follicles actually shuts down the Wnt pathway, and that's one of the reasons the hair growth is stunted in the scalp of men and women genetically predisposed to androgenic alopecia. So it's not strictly a linear equation with DHT, since people who don't have the male pattern baldness gene can still have high amounts of DHT in their blood, but instead it is more related to the amount of DHT in the hair follicles, which ends up shutting down the Wnt pathway and thus stunting the growth of the hair follicles. SM04554 gets around this by restoring the Wnt pathway without affecting DHT at all. It is an interesting idea and it may work, but the Wnt pathway is very powerful. It's a very powerful pathway in all the cells of the body, and even though SM04554 is a topical, it will be important to see if it is safe, because this may be a tricky balancing act to modify this pathway somewhat, but not too much so it doesn't end up causing trouble in other cells. Also, Another thing I mentioned is that being that it is a topical, I am worried if it will have effectiveness for people who are diffuse thinners or people who have hair loss all over, since they may need more of the topical solution to get full coverage. But as the research has shown with SM04554, if you use more than the required dose, it may actually be counterproductive and even cause hair loss. So more is not necessarily better. So if it comes in, let's say, a 1 milliliter solution dose, that may not cut it for some people. But still, I am nevertheless looking forward to see what results, if any, come from this big clinical study of SM04554 that has apparently already finished enrollment, and we're just waiting for the results. So hopefully we don't get an RU58841 type situation where we never hear back from them on their clinical trials. So in this spirit of boldly going to unexplored worlds of androgenic alopecia treatments, let's take a look at another potential treatment option for androgenic alopecia called Cetirizine. This sounds like the manufacturer of exotic sports cars, but what Cetirizine is that it's basically just Zyrtec, and that is an over-the-counter drug in the US for the treatment of allergies like hay fever. It is an antihistamine like Benadryl, but it causes less sleepiness than Benadryl, which is often used as a sleeping pill because of its drowsiness effects. Unlike Benadryl, though, Cetirizine is a histamine blocker that specifically blocks the H1 histamine receptor, and it doesn't penetrate into the brain that much either, meaning it is better tolerated and, like I said, causes less sleepiness. But what does an antihistamine drug have to do with hair loss? Well, as it turns out, antihistamines have nothing to do with your hair, so I should just go ahead and end the video right now and give my usual speech about how finasteride is so amazing, right? Well, not so fast. Even Minoxidil has technically nothing to do with hair loss either, because it is a blood pressure medication, and despite what Blutflugard says, blood pressure has nothing to do with hair loss. That is why you still see obese smokers who have full heads of hair. Now, there are several theories behind how minoxidil works, which I'm not going to get into here, but the underlying point is we don't know for sure how minoxidil works, but its effect is certainly unrelated to what the drug was manufactured for, namely controlling blood pressure. So it turns out that Cetirizine's main purpose as an antihistamine doesn't have anything to do with hair loss either. Instead, it's another effect of Cetirizine that was discovered way back in 1989 that explains its effects on hair growth. So as you can see here, Cetirizine lowers prostaglandin D2 production. Now, I've done a couple of videos on prostaglandin treatments before, including a video on latanoprost, bimatoprost, as well as a separate video on castor oil, which I'll link below because that also affects prostaglandins. But to summarize some of the data on that, well, latanoprost and bimatoprost are similar to what's called prostaglandin F2 alpha, which is a hair growth stimulant, and castor oil reduces prostaglandin D2, which inhibits hair growth. However, the science on both of these drugs for the treatment of androgenic alopecia is pretty weak, even if the theory is interesting. So, what is the theory on prostaglandins, and what are prostaglandins? Well, prostaglandins are a group of lipid-based substances that act like hormones, and that they regulate several bodily processes, and particularly they regulate the inflammation response. So something like aspirin is an anti-inflammatory that works by inhibiting prostaglandins. They are generally produced and act locally as opposed to other hormones, like for example growth hormone that is produced in the pituitary gland and acts on other tissues like skeletal muscle and bone. There are many different kinds of prostaglandins, and they are identified by the letters PG followed by a letter and then possibly a number afterwards. So that is how we have names like PGE2 and PGF2 alpha that stimulate hair growth, while prostaglandin PGD2 seems to inhibit hair growth in animal studies at least. So what makes prostaglandins interesting is there seems to be a connection between prostaglandins, DHT, and the Wnt pathway, as we discussed with SM04554. It is known that prostaglandin D2 is elevated in men with androgenic alopecia, as this article here discusses, and we know that too much DHT suppresses the Wnt pathway, thus preventing the formation of dermal papilla hair cells from stem cells. So prostaglandins affect the Wnt pathway, which, as we know from the SM04554 studies, is instrumental in hair growth. So apparently, the good prostaglandin PGE2 stimulates the Wnt pathway, and it is theorized that the prostaglandin PGD2 may inhibit the Wnt pathway. So if DHT increases prostaglandin D2, that may be the mediator of the effect of DHT on the Wnt pathway, as is proposed here by one of the papers, which I'll link below and show you a quote from. Well, you guys who have watched my channel for a while, you generally know what my opinion is on theory, and that is that I really don't give a shit. I mean, any pencil turtleneck egghead or basement-dwelling neck-bearded keyboard warrior from 4chan or from a hair loss forum can establish a theory, but that means pretty much fuck all without actual outcome-based evidence. So, is there any outcome-based data on cetirizine as an effective treatment for hair loss? Well, I'd like to say I'm about to go balls deep to explore this, but sadly we only have 2 studies that really address this question, but let's work with what we've got here. So, the first study in question was from Italy and was published in 2018. It is entitled A Preliminary Study on Topical Cetirizine in the Therapeutic Management of Androgenic Alopecia. This was a study on 85 men and women who were aged 20 to 60 years with various grades of androgenic alopecia. 67 patients were treated with topical cetirizine and 18 were control patients. The cetirizine was a 1% cream applied daily, while the control patients were treated with the same inert base ointment without the cetirizine, so basically it was just a placebo. The results were evaluated with trichoscans, meaning magnified photographs, which measured total hair density, including weak vellus hair, as well as strong terminal hair density, and also hair diameter was measured before treatment and after 6 months of treatment. So controls were put in place to make sure none of the subjects were on any other hair loss treatments, such as finasteride or minoxidil, so this sounds like a randomized, controlled, blinded study, but the paper doesn't say this, so it is possible it wasn't blinded and that there could be some bias in interpreting the results. However, the endpoint of counting hairs on trichograms is pretty objective as opposed to just evaluating photographs that can be influenced by things like lighting or hairstyling, as bullshit artists do often to promote their products all the time. So even if it wasn't a blinded study, the trichograms were probably pretty reliable. Also, it wasn't funded by a drug company, so there doesn't seem to be much bias in the study as far as I can tell. So, what were the results? Well, they showed an 11% increase in hair density and hair diameter with cetirizine, with an 18% increase in terminal hair density and a 15% decrease in vellus hair density, which is a good thing because it means those vellus hairs probably went terminal. The control group had only minor changes in these parameters, reflective of what we'd see from just a regular hair growth cycle. The researchers don't give any statistics, so it's impossible to know if these changes were really just due to chance or if the drug had any effect. And, the data right now suggests that cetirizine had a real effect, though we don't have any yardstick that we can use to compare these results to the kind of results we know exist in clinically proven treatments like finasteride minoxidil. They do also provide some pictures, which you can see here, and the top row is before treatment and the bottom is after 6 months of treatment. Now, as many of you guys know already, I'm always suspicious of things like this because, these images were out of 67 people treated in the study, so why did they pick these particular 4 people to show their photos? I mean, is this a typical result, or are these the absolute best results they found? Now, again, these investigators don't seem to be working for a drug company, so maybe these are just typical results, but who knows? With photo assessments, you can easily just cherry pick the absolute most favorable outcome, but they may not be representative of what the drug does to the average person, as you see across the general population of people who are using it. So, that is basically the end of the study, and unfortunately there is not a whole lot more human research on this drug that has been published, at least so far, but there is one other study published just last year, though this one is from Egypt, and it is titled, quote, Therapeutic Implication of Topical Cetirizine 1% in the Treatment of Male Androgenic Alopecia, a Case-Controlled Study, unquote. It is somewhat unintentionally humorous, though, because it coins the term MAGA for male androgenic alopecia and FAGA for female androgenic alopecia. So they note in their introduction that there is only one prior study on cetirizine in androgenic alopecia, and that's the one we just went over, so no need to revisit that. But in this newer Egyptian study, they try to be more scientific. What they did is they designed a double-blinded randomized trial that actually uses statistics to analyze the results, unlike the earlier study where they didn't bother with statistics and didn't make it clear if the study was randomized and blinded. There were 60 men enrolled, aged 22 to 45 years, all with at least Norwood 2 androgenic alopecia. They were divided into 2 groups of 30 subjects. One group got 1% cetirizine solution daily, and the other got a control placebo solution. The solutions were sprayed on the hair, so this wasn't like a cream in the last study. It would be more like liquid minoxidil and how it's applied. And during the study, the hair was assessed at baseline and then again after 6 months of treatment. They use photograph assessments by dermatologists, and they also used a dermoscope to count hairs, which is pretty much the same thing as a phototrichogram. They also use subjective assessments regarding the degree of improvement or worsening that occurred over the 6 months, which means the dermatologists and subjects just basically gave their opinions on how things were going while they were on treatment. The results using photos showed no improvement in any of the control subjects, but 43% of the cetirizine subjects had some improvement. There was mild improvement with cetirizine in 33%, and good improvement in 7%, 7% I should say, and this is based on dermatologist assessment. So it's subjective and it could mean different things to different people, but it probably is at least accurate enough to say they got results and that the difference between the groups was statistically significant, meaning not due to chance alone. Results using the dermoscope microscope seemed to correlate with these assessments, as it showed no new hairs growing in the control group, but in the treatment group there was at least one new growing hair in 20% of patients, two new hairs in 17% of patients, and three new hairs in 7% of subjects when looking at the same area under the microscope. Unfortunately, we don't know how big the area was, so for all we know, this could be based on them looking at half the entire scalp, in which case three new hairs would really not be that impressive, especially when we consider that even relatively weak hair loss treatments like Minoxidil are known to grow about 4,000 hairs all over the entire scalp. When looking at the patient's self-assessment in the control group, it showed no improvement in 87% and worsening in 13%. In the cetirizine group, there was no improvement in 57%, mild improvement in 23%, moderate improvement in 17%, and one subject had good improvement, which makes up 3% of the entire group. In their discussion, they discussed some other mechanisms whereby prostaglandin D2 may hurt hair growth. It can activate cytokines, which are basically substances that can cause apoptosis, which is cellular death in the hair follicles. It also activates a GR44 receptor, which is increased androgenic alopecia, and this also inhibits hair growth by unknown mechanisms. So besides the effect on the Wnt pathway, there are other pathways by which prostaglandin BGD2 hurts the hair, but remember, DHT actually increases PGD2, so even with all this fancy theory, we keep coming back to DHT, which is the underlying problem that triggers off all these different adverse biochemical pathways that do the dirty work of killing all of our hair follicles. I bring this up because oftentimes when people get their research from hair loss forums like I used to do, there will always be some dorky know-it-all who will write some overly verbose post saying about how everybody has it wrong and haha, it isn't the DHT, it's the PGD2 that is killing our hair, or they'll say that is some other X or Y factor, but it doesn't really matter because all these are just downstream effects triggered off by the DHT that is ultimately what is killing our hair follicles. So, you can go ahead and try to mitigate these downstream effects by blocking prostaglandins or stimulating the Wnt pathway, but ultimately the best way currently available to tackle hair loss is to take out the son of a bitch who's causing all these horrible things to happen to begin with, and that means killing the damn DHT. So you can go ahead and just kill the alien invaders constantly, or you can just take out the mothership and get it all over with. So getting back to the study, the researchers admit that their study has some obvious limitations. They say, quote, bioavailability of cetirizine in follicular hair sheath and dose-dependent hair growth in comparison with other FDA-approved medications is mandated before judging the appropriateness and safety of our treatment, unquote. They conclude by saying that studies on cetirizine are lacking and more randomized and controlled studies are needed. Particularly, this treatment needs to be compared to standard treatments like the FDA-approved treatments such as Minoxidil and finasteride. So, looking at clinicaltrials.gov, there is a study registered there that plans to enroll 60 patients and compare 1% cetirizine with 5% minoxidil. This study, which doesn't look like it has started yet, would be interesting because it compares the new treatment cetirizine with a standard hair growth treatment like minoxidil, and this will give us at least some yardstick to compare this stuff with something we know works. And of course, minoxidil by itself at least is not as effective for androgenic alopecia as is finasteride. So cetirizine is going to have to absolutely knock it out of the park in this study if it hopes to replace finasteride, which of course is the gold standard for treating androgenic alopecia, at least as of today. So cetirizine is not commercially available, although it may be possible to purchase it on the gray market, but don't ask me about that. There are other antihistamine creams that exist, like Benadryl cream, but I don't think anyone is making any claims for these other antihistamine drugs in treating hair loss, but I wouldn't be surprised if the lab rats down on the hair loss forums decide to try to experiment with whatever they can find because they're too dickless to just bite the damn bullet and use finasteride. So, like I've said in my other videos on prostaglandins, prostaglandin treatments. I'm still not that impressed by them overall. I mean, they are interesting in that prostaglandins may be the missing link between DHT and the Wnt pathway, but so far the theory is more impressive than the outcomes of the clinical research, at least. Hopefully in a few years we'll have some better studies to try to put these treatments in their place. I mean, there is some attraction to these topical therapies because they may avoid systemic side effects, but I'm not betting that topical cetirizine is going to outperform good old-fashioned 5% minoxidil, which is not only clinically proven, but you can buy pretty much dirt cheap anywhere these days. So this is one of the problems I have with hair loss forums, is that whenever something new comes around, it will be hyped to the high heavens as the next hot new thing. But when you actually take a look at the research rather than just examining the theory, you realize it's not all that great. So I say just forget about cetirizine for now and just stick with what we know works, like finasteride and minoxidil. So that's all I've got for you guys today, but I'll be back with more content soon, so take care.